we're very interested in nature journaling, and then how that can connect with actual field work and ongoing field work as well. So
Yeah.
that's of interest to inform people of the work that was done there in the past, and then how that could
Yep.
form ways that people could move into conservation into the future towards a preferred future of
Mhm.
environmental sustainability.
The key thing for me is that there's all these fascinating basic ecological questions, and it's a biological wonderland, for anybody who wants to jump in there. But we've also got this ticking clock. A lot of the things are under severe threat, and unless you do something sensible in a management perspective, you're not going to have them there to look at anymore. So those are the pressing questions to me: is how do you actually manage these landscapes effectively to turn things around and keep these species going. So I flew out here from California to take up a job with CSIRO, and I flew via Canberra first and then across here. And I've looking out the airplane window, I saw the wheat belt underneath. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? What am I coming into? Because I'm an ecologist and I like working in nice places and looking at nice plants and all that kind of stuff. And I could see this apparently devastated landscape underneath me. And I thought, geez. And that was sort of reinforced the first few times I went out there, because it's dismal in places, especially in the middle of summer when it's 40 degrees and there's no grass left on the paddocks and the sheep are looking horrible and all that kind of stuff. But after a few years, I began to appreciate what's still in the landscape. And you only do that, as you say, by stopping and looking and hanging out in these little remnant areas, and up in the outcrops and in the trees and all that kind of stuff. And you get an appreciation for what's still there, and the amazing stuff that is still present in these areas. And as you were saying, all the interconnections. Some of the patches probably quite happily sit there without any other connections to the landscape at all. There's plants that disperse very small distances and things like that. But there's all the pollinating insects and all that, and a lot of the birds will be pollinators as well, and so they need to move around the landscape, and that's where things like trying to figure out whether corridors are important or whether the trees in the middle of the paddock produce stepping stones that allow things to move around. And again, that varies a lot. Some species can move quite large areas across open ground. So, like the galahs that you see out in the wheat belt, they were never there until the wheat belt was opened up for wheat. They're more of an inland bird, but they slowly spread, and they're all over the place. We have them nesting across the road from us here in Fremantle now. So some things can move with the times, and others seem a bit more stuck, and they're the ones that perhaps need help to be able to move from one place to the other, or help to survive in particular areas. They're putting out nesting boxes for the carnabies now, and things like that. So, to me, I think my whole opinion about the wheat belt changed, and I think it's a very valuable place to still think about as an important conservation resource. It's often not seen as a priority because the forests come first and the big sand plain areas come first and the Kimberley comes first and all that kind of stuff. But the wheat belt still has a huge amount in it, and it's unique, just like every other part of Western Australia. Things you find in the centre of the wheat belt, you're not going to find anywhere else in the world, so they're still important to conserve. So that's where I've ended up, and I think there's plenty going on that's hopeful that things can turn around. And it's more hopeful with the change in the farming situation, where marginal land is no longer profitable, and so you have to find something else to do with it, and putting it into carbon plantations or whatever is a viable thing to do. So it'd be nice to have a bit more help from the government for some of these things, but it seems like people are doing it by themselves to some extent. So yeah, so that's my philosophical take on the
That's
issue.
wonderful. It's very heartfelt, and you have a lot of company.
Oh, good. Well, that's good to hear. So just going back to your question about what the landscape looks like now, this is the current Google Earth image. So this is the big nature reserve that I focused on. And the main thing that you can see is that there's been a lot going on, but it's all relatively small scale, and it's all relatively, you know, thin strips of stuff going on. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff with the interceptor banks and the lines of trees and things like that. So these are all over the landscape, and they were one of the main strategies for trying to alter water flows and stop the salinity lower down in the landscape. There's probably a few patches that we could pick up if we zoomed in that would be actual, you know, revegetated blocks, but not many. And the activity was quite spatially diverse across the landscape. Some shires were very into revegetation, so they did a lot of revegetation. Other shires were more into trying to protect the remnant vegetation that was there, so they did more sort of fencing off and taking the livestock off and things like that. So it varies from place to place as to what went on.
You know, how would a community go about a revegetation program in the Kellerberrin region if there was an interest in doing that? How do they do it?
Funny if you'd say that. I'll get out of screen sharing, shall I? Stop share. There we are. So my first answer to that is that we thought about this quite a lot when we were working there. And one of the results of our work was this book called Reintegrating Fragmented Landscapes. And so it brought together all the information I've been telling you about, basically, you know, the history of the place, the existing fauna, what the farmers were doing, salinity, and all that kind of stuff. But as part of that, we realized, you know, this is a scientific book, costs $200 and nobody's going to read it, really. And so we had Ted Lefroy with us at the time. I don't know if you've come across Ted at all. He's a West Australian lad, but he's in Tasmania now. But as an accompaniment to this book, we actually produced this thing called the Revegetation Guide to the Central Wheat Belt.
Wonderful. We would love to find out where we can get a copy of that.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So this is 20 years old now. But the reason we did this was we realized that there was no guidance to do exactly what you said. You know, if people wanted to do revegetation, how would they do it in a sensible way? There were people doing revegetation, but they weren't necessarily using the right species in the right place and doing it so that it would be effective. And so we set about doing this, and we used the kinds of information that I was telling you about before. We tried to have the landforms and the vegetation lined up so that you could select species from within the communities that would be there, and then use them to revegetate. And for each of those, we had a list of species that you could use, and so we tried to pick the ones that were the easiest to germinate and things like that. So this book got sent out to every farming household in the Central Wheat Belt, and we actually did a survey as to how it was being used, and we had a reasonable uptake. So people at least read it, and some actually used it and changed the way they were doing things, and so it's quite good. Fortunately, things have moved on now, and there's a lot more understanding about this kind of stuff, and so. I don't know if you were down on the south. Did you come across Justin Johnson down there? Yeah.
Hi, Justin.
So Justin is doing exactly what we were suggesting doing here, in a much more refined way, because the understanding's moved on that yes, you have to look at the soils. You need to try and match the seed mixes to where you're going and all that kind of stuff. But none of that was there back then. So that's I think there is information out there now, and again, people who are getting into carbon are getting much more into this idea that you could have a carbon plantation with biodiversity outcomes as well. It doesn't need to be just the standard trees that don't do anything else. So the people like carbon neutral are getting into good species mixes and things like that. So there are, some good encouraging things going on. And, there's all sorts of things like Justin's program going on in other parts of the the wheat belt as well, which is great. So you spend a lot of time on the road, do you?
We do. We'll
Are you on the road currently?
No,
still in hiding?
We're actually, if we turn this around just for a second, you can kind of see what we're doing at the moment. See all of these?
Oh yeah, okay.
Panels, they're all part of a big mural that we're doing on the history and future of the Yilgarn Craton.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so that all comes together hopefully in about a month and a half, and we'll do a short doco on the whole project then, and that's the idea. So cool. Yeah, that's for Wave Rock. But tell us about Kellerberrin. What this is really about is giving us some ideas on how to approach this artwork. What are the stories that we can unlock and tell through this process?
I came here from Scotland via the US in 1984 to join a CSIRO program that was just starting up called the Dynamics of Fragmented Ecosystems, and that was specifically directed to look at the remnant vegetation in the wheat belt and figure out how it worked and how to manage it better, basically. And I was appointed, first of all, as a fire ecologist because I did my PhD on fire back in Scotland. So the original idea of this project was that we'd look at some of the remnant vegetation, some of the patches, and do a lot of detailed work on their ecology and how the plant communities worked and how the animal communities worked and all that kind of stuff. And so we had a program trying to do experimental fires, and people were doing surveys of birds and the vegetation and all that kind of stuff. And we spent a lot of time touring around, first of all, to find a suitable site to focus on. And we settled on the area just north of Kellerberrin. And I can't actually remember the rationale for that now, but we wanted somewhere that had a lot of patches in it, but maybe one big reserve that could act as a kind of bigger focus that we could work on. And so the area north of Kellerberrin was ideal for that because it had Darracoppan Nature Reserve, which is a fairly big reserve for that part of the wheat belt, and lots of different patches. And so we set up shop up there. We rented an old farmhouse north of Kellerberrin on the Kellerberrin Training Road, and did a lot of work out there, detailed work on all sorts of aspects of the vegetation and so on. But what started out as looking at the remnants then slowly morphed into thinking about where the remnants were and how the rest of the landscape was affecting them. Because really we discovered there's no point in just looking in the remnants. It's actually everything else that's happening in the landscape that's affecting them. And the approach before then had been to just look at the remnants as if they were islands. So I don't know if you know about island biogeography. I mean, that goes way back. So they applied that. The museum did a bunch of surveys around the wheat belt in the 70s, mostly just doing species counts and all that kind of stuff, vegetation surveys. And then they did a number of papers which looked at this island biogeographic idea where the size of the remnant determines how many species you're going to have in it, just because there's more space and more niches and all that kind of stuff. And we discovered that was only really part of the story because as I said, what happens in the reserve actually is affected strongly by what's outside it. So these things aren't actually islands. They're having all the stuff that's going on in the surrounding landscape coming into them as well. So that includes weeds and fertilizer input, the feral animals, foxes, cats, all that kind of stuff. And at that stage, the big deal was salinity. That was the scary thing that everybody was worried about, mostly from an agricultural perspective, but we also realized that it was likely to impact the remaining native vegetation as well. So that sort of got us spread out into not just the ecology of the remnants themselves, but the the broader use of the landscape, the agriculture, the social dimensions of it, how the farmers interacted with the remnant vegetation and how it fitted in with what they were doing. So that got us into landscape ecology broadly, and set us thinking in entirely different directions about how this fragmentation was affecting the ecosystems out there. And so we did a whole bunch of work on weeds and edge effects, how the edge of the remnant is the part that interfaces with the surrounding agriculture. And so that's where a lot of it happens. Just a whole bunch of ideas about habitat for animals as well. There were plenty of birds still around, but where the population is viable, was there enough vegetation for them to persist and so on. And those kind of studies led us into not just thinking about the broader landscape, but also thinking about what to do about it and how to start restoring both some of the degraded remnant areas, but also the broader landscape as well. How do you put function back into a landscape that's been severely impaired by the excessive clearing that's gone on, the salinity that was happening, and so on? So that got us into a whole bunch of stuff about revegetation and how to do that. And again, that brought us into interface with the farming community, and how prepared they were to think about revegetating part of their land, and where to do it and how to do it best and all that kind of stuff. And so that took us into thinking about how to go about returning post-agricultural land to some kind of native vegetation. And there were a few sort of pioneer farmers around at the time who were trying to do that on a relatively isolated scale. The rest of the farming community thought they were nuts and they didn't want anything to do with it. But there were various schemes on the go to try and encourage this. So Tagesasti as a fodder crop was one that was big, especially in the more western parts. Oil mallee production was a big thing. They thought if you could produce oil mallees in rows, you could make a productive crop out of that, and at the same time have perennial vegetation back in the ground. And these were all good ideas, but none of them was the magic bullet that was going to fix everything. And so people were still looking for that, I suppose. I very quickly came to the conclusion that there is no magic bullet. There might be lots of little magic bullets that can work together to build a bigger picture, but there's not going to be one thing that's suddenly going to change and make it all better, with the exception perhaps of carbon, if the carbon market ever came off. And even though it's not, there's still a lot of activity around carbon that's happening. So those are the kind of things that have been in the mix of what I've been doing. And like I say, we focused for a long time just on that area around Kellerberrin. So we have some quite good information about the ecosystems there, the plants, some of the animals and all that kind of stuff. That lasted until about the mid-90s, and then CSIRO's funding model changed and we lost our core funding and had to go chasing the money wherever we could find it. And that's not a good strategy for when you want to try and keep a long-term project going. You basically have to follow the money wherever it takes you. So we kept working at Kellerberrin in a less intense way, I suppose, for another few years, but then eventually we dispersed and we've been working elsewhere, including in other parts of the wheat belt, but also in the coastal plain and elsewhere like that. So that's my sort of trajectory, and along the way, I think maybe I've explained how the ideas in the wheat belt progressed. When we started, really there was very little known about a lot of the ecosystems in the wheat belt, or most of them. There was a big focus on the sandplain heaths, and there was a big focus here in Western Australia on the forests. But like the wheat belt woodlands and so on, there was very little known about them. And you know what astounded me, the first time I went out there and looked around and saw these amazing salmon gums, for instance, these beautiful, beautiful trees. And when I looked around to see what was known about the ecology, not a lot at all. So, and you could do that with just about anything you pointed to out there. There was a few people working on odds, there was a little bit of work done on Wandoo and things like that. But by and large, the flora and a lot of the fauna really was significantly understudied. There'd been basic surveys and a few little idiosyncratic studies here and there, but not much at all known about a lot of the stuff out there. So that was the first big task, before you could actually understand how to manage these things. You actually had to figure out, one, what was there, and two, how it worked. And so that's the sort of lifetime work in ecology for hundreds of people. So and to me that's the same wherever you go in Western Australia. There's a few places where there's keen individuals who have done a lot of work, a lot of stuff about it, but there's vast areas and whole ecosystems that we still don't know much about, which is kind of sad, really. So that's me downloading my initial blurb. So what else would you like to know?
Well, if you were to look down on Kellerberrin and visualize it, what do you see as the connections between these different so-called islands that aren't islands and within them too? Because we're thinking about an artwork that's partially an artwork as such. It's partially a scientific model of landscape ecology of the region, and the closer that we can get to using our art as a tool for visual literacy to understand the natural system, I think the happier that we'd be in feeling that we were successful in our role as the kind of field naturalist end of this project.
I was also interested, Richard, those islands that you're talking about, have they grown or have they shrunken at all since the time of the 70s or the 80s when you were working on them?
Okay. Well, maybe this is the segue to show you a few pictures, because that might help explain what I'm talking about. So let's see if I can do that. This, of course, is the classic satellite view of the wheat belt, and the various. I mean, it's a big area, as we all know, and the thing is that it varies quite a lot in the amount of vegetation that's left and the type of vegetation and so on. And some of the areas, the most earliest cleared areas in the central wheat belt, are some of the, there's hardly any vegetation there. And so that's where these small isolated remnants are. This is just another view of that, and so the little colored areas are the remaining native vegetation, and then superimposed on that now this is the Avon catchment, so the broader Avon catchment, which is where Kellerberrin sits, and of course it's a huge area. I think Haydn's still in the Avon catchment as well, where you've just been, but I'm not sure. And the big thing about this area is that it's mostly in the zone of ancient drainage. I don't know if you know about the Meckerine line, and on the west side it's the zone of rejuvenated drainage where things drain to the ocean. Whereas east of that it mostly drains inland, except for extreme rainfall events. So that's where you get these broad valleys, long slopes, and they mostly saline systems down at the bottom of them. So this is where Kellerberrin sits in that, and as we thought we're picking a representative area of this central wheat belt area, it turns out that it's not really representative at all, because there's a lot more vegetation in that bit that we studied than there is in other parts of it. This was the center of our study. So this is the Kellerberrin training road up here. And this was a big reserve, the Darragh Reserve, and a few other reserves scattered around the place, and a lot of native vegetation on farmland, on private land. And that's what characterizes this part of the wheat belt, and most of the wheat belt, actually. There's a few reserves around the place, and there's a lot of other agencies who have land as well, like the Water Corp and things like that. But a lot of the native vegetation is actually on farmland. And then a lot of it is also on roadsides, in these roadside strips. So where we were, the landscape looked something like this. So this is from John Beard's book, 1990 book, Plant Life of Western Australia. And of course, Beard did an amazing job mapping all the vegetation of Western Australia. And so that was some of the basic information that was available. If only he'd used a less idiosyncratic method of classifying the vegetation, it would have been even better. But anyway, we'll set that aside. So the basic landscape out where we were is you have the salt lake systems down at the bottom of the valley. You go through the lower slopes, which are predominantly salmon gum woodland, salmon gum gimlet. Then you go up the slope when you get into Wandoo and things like that. Then there's a mallee area higher up the slope, and you have the breakaway systems. And then you get up onto the top of the landscape where you have the Wodjil thickets, the Alacazurina thickets, and things like that. And then you get into the sandplain heathlands, which are the classic highly diverse proteaceous shrublands. So that's the kind of vegetation that we were working in. And of course, they have distinct landform characteristics and all that kind of stuff as well. So in terms of your questions, so this is that diagram sort of spread out. So here's the big reserve I showed you. And what this map shows you is the relative elevation. So the red areas merging through the yellow are the higher parts of the landscape, and the green areas are the lower parts. So what this tells you is that most of the remaining vegetation is actually in the higher parts of the landscape. It's not that much down in the bottom at all, where all the woodlands were. And the main reason for that is that the woodlands were on the better soils. They were cleared first and cleared most comprehensively. And the uplands weren't touched for a while because they couldn't sort out the trace element deficiencies in the soil for a long time. When they did that, it changed, but by that stage, they'd already set aside some of the vegetation for reserves and things like that. So this is the timeline of that area in terms of clearing. So obviously, originally it would have been all covered in native vegetation. The black is just native vegetation of any kind. And as you can see, it was progressively cleared through the 1920s, 1940s, 1960s, right up until the 1970s, really. There was still some clearing going on. And there was a lot more in other parts of the wheat belt as well. So when you're talking about whether these things have grown or shrunk, there's a long period when they actually shrunk quite significantly, but not in a kind of systemic way. There were bits disappeared here and there, so we're then left with the mosaic that you had now. What the big push was from the 90s onwards was to start putting vegetation back in the landscape. And so you could say that there has been some expansion since then, perhaps again, not in a systematic way as people would like, and often relating to the salinity question rather than the native vegetation question. So where do you put vegetation best to deal with the hydrological imbalance that we've caused? Although there was some push to start doing some strategic revegetation around key reserves so that you could increase the habitat for particular species. So that's the situation now. When the salinity issue was really front of everybody's minds, there was a lot of talk about having to do massive revegetation in these areas. They're talking about having to revegetate maybe up to 70% of the landscape or more, which kind of made sense because if the hydrology was imbalanced with 100% native vegetation before clearing, it made sense that you'd have to get back to somewhere around 100% perennial vegetation to fix that. And of course, that would mean that there wasn't any room for conventional farming after that. So there's all sorts of issues. The bottom line is that massive revegetation never happened. And there were a whole bunch of reasons for that. One, as I said, it was very hard to find a way to do it that would still allow profitable agriculture. Two, it was very expensive to do. And three, it was difficult to do it effectively because the actual processes of learning how to revegetate were only slowly developing. And then the final little ironic thing was that to some extent the salinity issue went away as well. It's not nearly as big an issue in people's minds as it was back in the, say, 80s and 90s. And the reason for that is that it's stopped raining as much. So instead of having salinity induced by rainfall coming in, the opposite problem is there now, that there's not enough rainfall to support agriculture, especially in the more marginal eastern areas. So so the focus really went off salinity significantly from the sort of early 2000s onwards, which is quite fascinating, really, considering how big an issue it was back then. And it's still an issue in the landscape, there's no doubt about it, but it's not the huge rates of spread that were predicted in the late the 90s and early 2000s haven't eventuated. These this massive salinization of the landscape hasn't occurred. So so these are the kinds of things that we see in the wheat belt. This is a moderately cleared area, so there's still a lot of vegetation around, and the corridors and things like that. Although there's a lot of vegetation around, it may not actually be in very good condition because it's had a lot of stuff happen to it, especially grazing by sheep and things like that. But then out in the central wheat belt, this is the kind of situation that you get where you just have these very small patches of vegetation left. And when you look at them, you think, my God, what's the hope for that? What's the value of them? But when you actually get into these places, depending on how well it's been treated, there's actually still an incredible diversity of stuff in there. And some of them are still, there's still a lot of stuff going on. And so, the question is, how best do you keep that going? Oops. So, and again, this is, the kinds of landscape. This is lower down, where you get a lot of woodland along the road reserves. We worked out that in that area, there are actually more salmon gums on roadsides than there were in any remnants or reserves or anything like that. And so we spent a lot of time to figure out whether things like this were actually important for the landscape to allow things to move around. And the answer with everything is sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So, but anyway, within these reserves, there's still some amazing vegetation. The intact salmon gum woodlands are fantastic. Wandoo woodlands, a lot of flora, very diverse flora, including a lot of annuals, which we picked up when we did our woodland work. The early surveys from the museum didn't include annuals. And so we discovered that there's this huge diversity of annuals in these woodlands which hadn't been seen before. In terms of the fauna, there's still stuff out in the wheat belt, the cockatoos, some of the mammals which are now just hanging on in places like Triandra and Boyagen. We know that these were abundant in the Kellerberrin area up until the 40s, 50s, and sometimes even 60s. And it's probably the foxes and cats that did for them. So I think you want to talk about species to choose for these things, and we can talk about that in a little while as well. But there's a lot of fauna of interest. What's this? Range of birds. And then, this is the bottom of the landscape with the primary saline systems, which are very interesting in their own right. They're incredibly diverse, both in the environments and also some of the species that they have. And interestingly, some of the species in these saline systems actually need fresh water to regenerate. So, it's not uniformly saline in these original systems. There's quite a mixture going on. But the problem is, of course, that salinity spread because of the clearing. And so this is a skull just outside one of the reserves near to we were working. And like I said, these were the predicted salinity spreads from models that were done. We were involved with projects in the early 2000s, I think. So this is the native vegetation, and then this is there'd be primary saline systems in there, but this was the projected spread of salinity over, you know, the matter of a couple of decades. And as I was saying, this hasn't really eventuated, and that's primarily because the rainfall declined, and so there wasn't so much water table rise as they predicted. So salinity sort of went away as a big issue, but not before it affected some of the vegetation quite significantly. And interestingly, you know, declaring a nature reserve doesn't actually protect the area from what's going on in the surrounding landscape, which is what I was saying earlier. So that's one of the issues. And then I think I went on to this one, which is a saline lake south of Kellerberrin, with a road going through it, and along the roadside was this population of Banksia cuneata, which is one of the listed Banksia species. It's very pretty. It's called matchstick Banksia, and this population is only one of several in that area. And there is one secure population in nature reserve further off this picture, but this population occurs along this roadside, and it's really very hard to manage because it's obviously a big long strip. It's got lots of weeds. They tried to burn it to get it to regenerate, but they didn't control the weeds at the same time, so they just made matters worse. But to me, this kind of epitomizes the conundrums faced in conservation in this area. You still have a huge amount of very valuable and interesting biology going on out there, but a lot of it's in situations like this that it's very hard to manage it and to look to see how it will be able to progress in the future without very intensive management. And of course, the money is not there to do that. So, you know, DBCA can't manage its own reserves, never mind the broader landscape. So it's, you know, that's an ongoing issue. So the road reserves are really very important in terms of what they retain. Some of the big trees, but also a lot of the declared rare flora occurs along road reserves. So these are salmon gums, and these are a very good example of that. But even in the remnants, so this is what you would call a good patch of woodland, which still has a lot of understory. It's ungrazed, and there may even be some tree regeneration happening in patches. But a lot of the remnants don't look like that at all. They look more like this. And basically they're just trees, and that's it. That's all that's left of the woodland. And the primary cause for this is grazing. Sheep grazing significantly alters the whole ecosystem, and changes. It gets rid of the shrubs, brings in non-native annuals and herbaceous things, and they then produce a cycle where the trees won't actually regenerate within that. And so you might call these the standing dead, if you like, or the ghost woodlands, because they still look lovely. They've still got these beautiful mature salmon gums, but they're not going to regenerate. So once they die, they're gone. And so, yeah, there's a lot of imagery around that. And the other thing about especially salmon gums, and wondu to some extent, is that they need some kind of disturbance for regeneration. So this is a copse of little salmon gum saplings, and it's there because this older tree died. And so it created what you might call a water gap in this case, where the seedlings can establish. So, and obviously you need to have the right conditions for that to occur. So it's a tricky situation to manage. And as I said, the primary culprit has been grazing. People use the woodlands for sheltering their stock in summertime and things like that. And they just bugger the whole place up. We discovered in our work that it is possible to reverse it. So we were able to do some work where we were able to get salmon gum regeneration happening and regenerate the shrubs as well. A lot of work again, but it did work. So this is an area where we actually ring barked a mature salmon gum, which was sort of, we had to really push to do this with the local community, which was great because they really are concerned about their trees, and the fact that we were going into to apparently kill a tree for the greater good was quite concerning to them, but it did actually work. So we got a young salmon gum community going. And then the final thing I want to say about that is that not only it's in the remnants, it's in the isolated trees around the place. These are all important as well. Studies elsewhere have shown that these paddock trees are really important to the functioning of the whole system, and they still provide a lot of shelter for insects and all that kind of stuff. And of course, these are under threat through more mechanized agriculture, where the bigger headers and all that kind of stuff. It's often there's a push to get rid of the trees in the middle of the paddocks, but they all contribute to the overall sort of native cover of the area, if you like. So that's all the visuals I've got for you. So what would you like to, anything you want to pick up on, or do you want to move on to thinking about individual species, or what?
They were wonderful to see. They're fantastic pictures.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, that one on the screen there is I can see how it would have been very nerve-wracking. Because you said, well, actually it did work, and thank goodness.
Well, thank goodness. I know, yeah, we'd have had our guts for garters if I hadn't. Which is good. I mean, it shows that the local farming community is concerned about it, and they, so they were on us about what we were doing, which is great.
So we were interested in what are some of the interesting relationships, the connections, symbiotic relationships between some of the species as well, because we're interested in these 15 species, threatened species, endemic species, and also to tell the stories about the behavior of these species and the relationships with other species in the region.
Sure.
Whether there's any interesting connecting stories between species.
Yes. Well, I mean, certainly, I mean, if you look at the dominant trees like the salmon gums, they're very important for other iconic species like the black cockatoos, so that's an obvious one. It depends what kinds of species you want. I mean, I assume you want a range from sort of big interesting things to tiny sort of unnoticeable things that are important, or things like that. I mean,
yeah, we would. I'm particularly interested in the species that people aren't necessarily that aware of because they're just not around anymore, and things that would be that would be important to highlight, that are somewhat need assistance, need help, or some degree of endemism to the region.
Sure. Well, one suggestion I have for you before I forget is trapdoor spiders. So I don't know whether you know much about trapdoor spiders, but Barbara York Main, who was the spider lady, she was a zoologist here in Western Australia. She grew up in Kellerberrin, and she went on to be this spider queen of the earth. Basically, she knew everything about spiders. But the interesting thing about her was that she studied a population of trapdoor spiders in a reserve west of Kellerberrin, more towards Taman, for over 40 years. She went back and followed these things, and she's renowned as having found the oldest spider in the world. So this spider died when it was 42 years old, I think, and she knew it was 42 years old because she'd been following it all that time. So, I mean, that to me is just an amazing story.
Amazing story.
Wow, we should put it in then. Yeah, we should definitely put it in. Have to.
Yeah. So,
wow.
And the other thing about the trapdoor spiders is they're myglomorphs, and they're one of these Gondwanan relics. So they're one of the ancient lineages that happen here. So, And I mean, the other interesting thing about Barbara, so she's got a book called Spiders. Barbara's dead now, but she really was a force in the whole spider field. But because she grew up in this area, she wrote this lovely little book called Between Waddle and Tor, which is all about this central wheat belt landscape. And it's just her observations from when she was young through to, you know, growing up and seeing the changes in the landscape, things like that. And so there's lots of, and she does her other own little pen drawings as well, you know, so it's a really nice little combination of sort of natural history observations and artwork and things like that. Yeah. And then the other one she wrote, which you might be interested in, was this thing called Twice Trodden Ground. And again, this is just a bunch of essays about this part of the world. And she calls it Twice Trodden Ground because she brings in the Aboriginal presence. And so, you know, she realizes that the Aboriginals were there. And then the white fella came along and screwed the place up, basically. So that's why it's called Twice Trodden Ground.
Can I ask, do you think these books will be available in a library? Like, does Kellerberrin have a library?
I'm not sure about that. I'm sure, yeah. I mean, they'd be available in like UWA library, I'm sure. I don't think they're actually, they might be available for sale now. Some things get republished, but possibly not. But anyway, I think if you're interested in the overall, you know, the history and that kind of, that's a great one. And as you know, Barbara was just amazing. She was a font of knowledge, as was her husband, Bert Main. And he worked in that area too. So yeah, so that's one little possible avenue, I think.
Can you tell us about the Eiselbergs? What role do these rocky outcrops play in shaping the ecology of the region?
Well, I mean, there's, I think, a very important one. And again, one of the species I had on the list was the rock wallaby, because there's a population of them on Mount Caroline, which is in the southern part of Kellerberrin. And that's been the focus of a lot of conservation work to try and maintain that population, you know, through fox control and all that kind of stuff. So to me, that's a nice little iconic species that has managed to hang on in these vastly altered landscapes. And the reason they can hang on is because they inhabit these granite outcrops, which are just amazing. Their islands, they're different from the fragments, you know, they're original parts of the landscape. And because they were rock, obviously, they often weren't messed up as much as the surrounding area. So there's all sorts of things on there that are interesting, and you know, there's the whole sort of annual communities and the rock pool communities that have with species sorting on the depth of the water during winter and things like that. And then there's the resurrection plants, which are another iconic one, if you ask me, you know, the boreas and things like that. Amazing adaptations to this kind of harsh environment. And, you know, I couldn't believe it when I first saw them in this summer and thought, oh, well, that's them gone. And then, you know, as soon as it rains there, they pop back up again. So, you know, it's remarkable. So, yeah, I think, and going back to the Aboriginal presence in the landscape, it's interesting that our entire CSIRO program, for the majority of the time we were working out there, had no contact at all with any Aboriginal people. No, coming from Scotland, I didn't know there was still an Aboriginal presence there, and it's only, you know, it was only later that I realised that yes, there was still connection there. And you know, talking to people, well, Noel Nannup in particular. His appreciation and deep knowledge of the landscape makes you wonder how they, you know, it's like they had access to satellite imagery, because he could tell you exactly where all the granite outcrops were, and you know, the connections between them, the story behind them, and all that kind of stuff. So again, these outcrops were incredibly important for the Aboriginal people, and so that was another element to that whole story, I think.
Yeah, Noel's incredible. He's an ambassador to our project.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I met him in the late 90s, I think, and I was just blown away by by his knowledge and his willingness to share it. It's just remarkable. Yeah.
I was wondering your opinion of, do you think that deforestation affects rainfall? When you were talking about the salt, the salination, so, considering the slowing down of salination, whether that's, a long cycle going on there.
Yeah, well, there is some evidence that clearing the wheat belt has reduced rainfall, because my former colleague at Murdoch University, Tom Lyons, did a lot of work. He was an atmospheric scientist, and he did a lot of work on how rainfall could be affected by changes in vegetation cover. And it seems fairly, you would have to think that clearing that amount of land and changing the evapotranspiration and all that kind of stuff must have some effect on cloud formation and so on. So yes, undoubtedly, I think that's probably all part of the story. Yeah, and there's no doubt. Well, this winter is proving a slight anomaly in that we're getting a lot more rain than we have for a long time. But the long-term trend has been a decline in rainfall over the whole southwest, and that seems fairly inexorable. And obviously, it affects all sorts of things, including the farming out in the eastern parts of the wheat belt and so on. So yeah, so I think it's probably something in it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
that's good to hear, because it's something that we could possibly touch on in the artwork.
yeah, we're always trying to visualize. What are the visualizations? I think it's sort of a key critical question to you is, sometimes when we're with Nathan McCoy, he'll sketch something out and then we kind of use that sketch somewhere in the artwork. So two things in mind. What are the things if you were to go back, what are the questions that is still on your mind, things that you'd like to explore further? And how do you visualize the dynamics of these landscapes when you're doing this field work? If you talked about the Aboriginal perspectives in looking down on the landscape, how are you seeing the landscape? If we can get inside your head, the visualization?
You don't want to be inside my head, I can tell you. Yeah. Well, like I say, I've not really done a lot of intensive work out there for a while, but it's still, I think there's still a huge amount to be done. Like I said, scratch the surface and next to nothing about many of the systems out there. And so, there's still a lot of basic ecology to be learned. And we're talking about interactions between things. Well, they're abounding. And the one thing about going to university was that you could actually get students onto some of these questions. So we had a student who studied a species of termites out in the Kellerberrin sites for 3 years. And so these are the mound termites in the Wandoo woodland, and they have a big influence on soil properties, and there's all sorts of connections there. And then the fungi as well, the other ones that are hardly known at all. We did have a couple of people from CSIRO, including Neil Bouger, who was there at the time. Neil's the fungi guy who's written the book on on the fungi of Western Australia. And they just found this incredible diversity of fungi, and that obviously has a huge influence on the fungal connections underground to all the trees. And they're discovering around the world that these fungi play a very important role, not just in helping the trees to get nutrients and so on, but trees actually communicate via them as well. So it's called the world, what was it called, the World Wood Web. So there's all this stuff like that we are only really just getting to grips with. And so there's many lifetimes of stuff to look at. Fortunately, some of them don't appear to be quite such fragile, shrinking violets as they've been portrayed. They're actually quite tough little things, and they can hang on in these incredibly, apparently horrible situations. So there is hope that you can keep them going. But obviously, the more help that you can give them, the better it will be. So those were always my interest in using the basic biology to try and help understand and manage things better. So
when we were in Canberra, we did a project for a while at Mulligan's Flat. They'd done it, fenced off that area, and in fact, the model of the Mulligan's Flat ecology, the species in there, I just did it as something that I was doing with a professor at the Fenner School, but it turned out that that model became the foundations for the gene stream songline sculpture, that phylogenetic.
Is that right? Oh, okay.
That's where it comes from. We altered the design a lot to get it to the point that we're at now. But is the fencing off of these remnant areas a positive step forward? The way they've done it at Mulligan's is that?
Well, there's examples here too. Dryandra is a case in point where they used fox baiting a lot, but also they got a fenced area in the middle of Dryandra now where the populations of little furry things are hopping around and doing very well. So yes, the role of fencing is to keep things like stock, but more importantly, the predators out. And if you can get on top of the predator problem, I'm sure many things would bounce back. Literally, because they're all little hopping things. But that's another story of interaction, because the digging mammals that have been lost undoubtedly played a huge functional role in the ecosystems. We've had work going on with woylies and bettongs here on the coastal plain. Not bettongs. What do you call them? Anyway, bandicoots. Sorry, bandicoots. And it's clear that their digging strongly influences the soil properties, the ability for plants to regenerate, the amount of woody material that's around that affects fuel loads and things like that. So there's a huge missing part of these systems where these have disappeared, and that includes most of the wheat belt. So these where these animals are present, the soil properties and the soil, everything that's going on are quite different. So that's another case where there's strong interactions. You lose an important part of the ecosystem, and because a lot of people don't know they were ever there, that's normal to them. But when you start putting them back and you see what they actually do, you can see what a huge influence they will have. So that's another. And there are a lot of moves, especially amongst the NGOs, for reintroducing these things into safe havens and things like that. So to me, that's a very positive move, just from all sorts of perspectives.
That was interesting to hear that.
Very interesting. We have 7 minutes left. So firstly,
okay.
I want to thank you very, very much for your time. It's been really, really fantastic and enriching.
And thank you for your expertise. Thank you for your expertise. It is very, very interesting.
Yeah, it really helps us kind of get inspiration towards some foundation visuals, because often when we think about these artworks, it's a little bit like a layering process. What are the layers that go into an artwork? And that it's giving us some guidance in terms of some of the layers you'd like to leave us with.
Because what I was going to say was, when you travel through a landscape, as a visitor, you don't get a chance to see or hear any of the story.
No, you don't.
Those books by the Spider Queen was very interesting to see that was basically a journal of her growing up and living there.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
We'd like to encourage more of that within the community, and also to see that as some kind of record keeping tool of a check.
Sure.
on
Yeah.
projecting into
Well,
that.
you know, I think, well, you're in this space already, but as a scientist, I've discovered that people relate much more to stories than to facts. And so I think a bit of storytelling is very important.
Yeah. Yep. And the two of them, we try and put the two of them together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Cool.
All
All
right.
right. It's very cool meeting you. Thank you so
You
much.
too. Thanks. That's great. Well, I'm glad it worked out. And you know, if you want any background information or references, just shoot me an email and I'll see what I can rustle up for you.
Yes, that would be brilliant.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
So much.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.